name is Nico Popow, and today I'm going to give a presentation on the ideas behind my paper called Counternorms. The initial impetus for this paper was to respond to one of the most robust social ontologies that have emerged in recent years that drew inspiration from the work of Axel Honneth at Columbia University. Axel Honneth is one of the last great avatars of the Frankfurt School theory, tradition of critical social theory. And I mainly, in the paper, focus on the work of Rahel Yagi, one of his star pupils, who extends and develops certain of his concepts in order to explain how it is that social change, positive social change, is possible. The two most important concepts for Rahel Yagi's account are normative surplus and forms of life. I'll start with normative surplus. The idea of normative surplus is that existent institutions in Western capitalist democracies are driven by, are grounded in principles that undergird the various bureaucracies and institutional frameworks and concrete decision-making that goes on in them. And the idea behind this concept of normative surplus is that even though, if you take any institution in these societies, take the American legal system, for instance, as a paradigmatic case, there's a massive gap between the ideals of equality before the law, innocent until proven guilty, etc. There is a gap between those normative principles and the concrete unfreedom that occurs at the level of their implementation. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for why that unfreedom persists. Reasons having to do with the wealth gaps and class antagonisms produced by capitalism. Reasons that have to do with institutionalized racism, geography, culture, etc. But the move here is that however tarnished those principles appear to be, those normative principles that justify and teleologically orient the practices within those institutions, they are not fully degraded. They are not fully tarnished to the point where we should throw them out. This is Axel Honneth's idea that Rahel Yagi takes up. Rather, they have to be affirmed. We have to stand by those principles because we can use them to critique the practices and the disparities at the concrete level of implementation. And in fact, Axel Honneth claims that our only normative justifications really can derive from those principles, from the normative surplus that we can tap into at the level of those institutions. Now, this idea harmonizes with the dictates of immanent critique, the idea that institutions can be critiqued from the inside, on the playing field of their own principles and their own practices, rather than dragging in some transcendent criteria that just have no grounding in them whatsoever, that don't even show up at the level of the vocabularies that circulate within them. So that is normative surplus. And Rahel Yagi's contribution to this, what her social ontology really brings to the table that is new, is this other concept that I mentioned, forms of life. Forms of life are meant to be broader than mere institutions. They can be cultural practices that occur at the level of everyday life that have to do with dress, speech, body language, values, many of which are not explicitly codified and are not institutionalized. So Rahel Yagi wants to show how those forms of life, although seemingly not subject to the same kind of organizational dictates and codified rules and principles as other more overt top-down institutions, her idea is that those forms of life, whether they be occurrent in a family unit, whether they persist at the workplace, or in the various microcultures that are, sometimes coexisting uneasily. Her idea is that those forms of life always will have norms that one can extract, and those norms are self-updating. They run into all sorts of problems at the level of implementation, just like the broader institutions mentioned before. And they repair themselves over time if they are going to persist, if they are going to exist as the sort of globalized international community continues to update. They generate their own problems. One of her examples is the bourgeois family, which is riven by a conflict between individual autonomy and the kind of collective considerations of the family as a unit. Those antagonisms over time are driven by conflicts inherent in the normative frameworks that undergird those forms of life, and they get better. They get more equitable, more free over time. So that's basically in a very schematic way, the social ontology that I'm sort of taking issue with and adding to and critiquing. I lay out in the beginning of my paper a number of problems that I have with this account. Just to mention a few, one is that it's very unclear whether capitalism itself functions as a form of life that kind of dominates and sets the conditions of possibility on all of the other forms of life that occur, that exist within it. This turns out to be a very important question and is a big blind spot in my judgment. But the main problem that I have, the central difficulty, is that I think that the ideal of immanent critique is being driven too far. And in the effort to dispose of this kind of transcendent appeal to trans-historical, universalist norms that don't really have any grounding in existent forms of life and institutions, all change has to occur at the level of what exists, at the level of the forms of life that exist and the institutions that are currently in operation. So there's no room really for something outside of those institutions or outside of those prevailing forms of life and power structures that would be a motor for social change. And this notion of normative surplus always only applies to norms that are already operative, even if they are imperfectly incarnated, even if they have some problems, they need some tinkering. Everything has to be immanent at the level of social reality. Now, I think that there are forms of social change that fall outside of this model. If you look at various revolutions, the French Revolution being a paradigmatic case, there are instances where social movements and forms of resistance to prevailing power structures, to the existing aristocracy, and even the capitalist state apparatuses, to use Louis Althusser's terminology. There are forms of resistance that arise that are not simply derivable from existent norms. Rather, new norms come on the scene that challenge the existing set of norms that are already in place. So when, the discourse of liberté and equality arises seemingly out of nowhere during the French Revolution, it's radically in conflict with the old aristocracy that held a hegemonic position in France and elsewhere. And it's a mistake, in my judgment, to reduce these norms, which I count under my terminology as counternorms. It's a mistake to reduce those to existing normative frameworks. So my concept of the counternorm is meant to denote those norms that emerge during social struggle that are non-derivable from existing normative frameworks and that adjust or alter or add to those normative frameworks by challenging them so strenuously. They are not immanent in the same way that the concept of normative surplus latches onto. I give some examples of this in the middle of my paper, slogans that seemingly crop out of nowhere during social uprisings or insurrections. For instance, the Black Lives Matter movement emerge in disconnection with existent institutions or forms of life as a kind of radical negation of those other forms of life and normative frameworks. The final part of my paper is meant to connect this notion of counternorms to the concept of universality, which has fallen into some disrepute due to the rise of various strands of critical theory, already there's a critique of universality even in Marx, who sees it as a bourgeois notion that plays a strictly ideological role in ensuring the continuance of the capitalist order. But also post-colonial and decolonial theory and critical race theory have presented some very compelling criticisms along the same lines that unveil the really scandalous and terrible uses of the concept of universality as a cover for the most pernicious colonial practices of domination and exploitation carried out by European states and white settlers on indigenous populations. That being said, it's important to remember that the ideological history of this term, universality, is a bit more complicated than that. It's not as if there has been a lot of good work to show that there are many anti-universalist ideological positions that emerged in order to try to justify those very colonial practices and oppressive power structures. And you can see why. If you cling axiomatically to the idea that people are radically incommensurate for racial or cultural or economic reasons, it's a good tool, just like in another way, universality is a good tool. But this anti-universalist position is a good tool for keeping, in a hierarchically structured society, every social group in their proper place, and foreclosing communication between those groups and the kind of unified struggle that could really pose a threat to the people at the top, the groups at the top that dominate everyone below. So in the final part of my paper, I tried to link this concept of the counternorm to the concept of universality. I take as an example Black Lives Matter as a kind of counternorm that emerges at a certain stage of capitalism, in a certain moment of the history of racialized oppression in America. And unlike many people that do have a soft spot in their hearts for the concept of universality and its necessary role, normative role that it plays in revolutionary uprisings or social movements, I take the concept of Black Lives Matter to be compatible with a certain notion of universality. I employ a roughly Hegelian model to understand this. I take a certain passage from the Phenomenology of Spirit, which talks about how a particular excluded element within a framework can somehow directly incarnate the universal truth of that social order, for instance, by being in a position of oppression or exception or domination in the context of that social order. That particular group, in this case, Black people living within American society, directly singularizes the universal and shows why the surface level ideology of universalism that is attached to those norms that Axel Honneth and Rahel Yagi focus on to elaborate their concept of normative surplus. Those norms are spuriously universal, universal in name only, because they neglect the position of an African American individual living in American society, which is living an exception to those norms, not covered in the same way by those rights and opportunities, and so on. The graph, the visual representation that I should have probably mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, shows how a counternorm at the top of the graph ruptures in a violent way the institutionalized normative fabric. And that happens on the left side of the graph, while also maintaining its connection with universality, which I call the indifferentiator of differences, because even though it is attached to, it will energize a particular oppressed group, it still maintains this potential from turning into a universal struggle in which anyone can join as an ally, in which various other oppressed groups can struggle in concert to realize an authentic universality, an authentically free society with institutions that really do practice what they preach. So that is basically the long and the short of my presentation, which all hinges upon this concept of the counter norm as a motor for social change and its connection with the kind of updated concept of universality that can explain how seemingly particularized, individualized social groups can become the vehicle through their slogans, through their struggle, through their demonstrations and resistance, can become the vehicle of real social change, and not this kind of incremental, gradualist social change that occurs at the institutionalized level that can sometimes proceed at a glacial pace. Thank you very much.